for every one of you. I know you've all been waiting for this. This is now becoming somewhat of an annual event. This year, the theme of the PechaKucha, or the PechaKucha, as I prefer to call it, is making architecture great again. Yeah, that's the theme. We're doing it with pizza. So if you recall from last year, those of you who were here last year remember that there's a ritual to the whole PechaKucha that we have to enact. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, as is always the case, no wagering. This is a no wagering event. Please do not wager on any of the participants in tonight's PechaKucha. Secondly, in order to start this event, we have to call the great gods of architecture to come to the foreground and participate with us. In order to do that, we have to do the PechaKucha song. Does anybody remember the PechaKucha song? Right? You don't remember it? You don't remember it? I remember it. Here's how it goes. Sing along with me. You put your right foot in, put your right foot up, put your right foot in, and you shake it all about. You do the PechaKucha and you turn yourself around, and that's what it's all about. Boom! Okay, that's enough. Not doing the second verse. We never get to the second verse because the gods of architecture get slightly upset by that. So, tonight, we'll do the PechaKucha. See why I call it PechaKucha? Because you can't do PechaKucha with the Hoochie Coochie song, can you? So you have to use that as our theme. We have a number of participants. Faculty have been training all day for this. Representing Architecture 460, faculty member Jana van der Goot has asked to be first at bat.
Not the first, one of them.
Well, you know, that's the problem with volunteering. Do you want a microphone?
Yes.
There you go.
I didn't want a hard act to follow, so I said I'd go first.
And then just give me 1 second to find it.
Have any of you actually you've watched this before? Okay. So just be patient with my timing. Because sometimes I'll talk too long and sometimes I won't have anything to say. And you know how it goes. Do you know? Yes. So tell me when I should start. Yes.
Ready to go.
Okay, go. Okay, so I wanted to show this first slide to tell you where I'm from. I'm from Michigan. So this is a sassafras plant, sassafras mitten, and I'm from Grand Rapids, which is right there. I also wanted to show this slide because while I'm a licensed architect, I have a degree in landscape architecture, and so I'm very interested in vegetative systems and the cross between landscape and architecture. Those of you who take site planning with me know that I love my Google Earth aerials, and I like this one in particular because it shows the phenomenon of lake effect. In Michigan, this is where I'm from, where the moisture from the lake creates this huge blanket of snow that drops on Grand Rapids. And that was me in Lake Michigan. I think I was tinkling there, but 2 years old. So when I was little, I'd always try to find these Petoskey stones, and they really fascinated me. They're actually petrified coral. And when I was little, it was really hard for me to get my mind around the fact that Michigan used to be an ocean, and that's why there was petrified coral. And I think that as an adult, that same kind of mystery and ambiguity in art objects and in design, stays with me. So I love the work of Isamu Noguchi and Barbara Hepworth, Brancusi, and Menhirs and Brittany. So this is a small-scale piece of furniture that I was commissioned to do that I think kind of plays with that ambiguity of something that's constructed and something that's natural. It's wrapped in a shell of steel, but on the inside you have this kind of soft wood made from reclaimed timber. This is an exhibit that I did at the University of Virginia called Table in Rome. And I was looking at the history of food plants, the grapevine, which creates wine, and the wheat plant, and trying to understand how those food plants create collective space, and I call that collective space table. So this is another image of that exhibit, and it was an interactive exhibit where I asked people who visited it to actually start shaping it and changing it And I think that was the best part of the exhibit, and it kind of activated the place instead of making it be this sort of static installation. I created a table for that exhibit out of like 300 pieces of scrap wood that I glued together and then routed. And one of the things I really liked about that table is that you could see the wood grain, but then also the grain of the machining of the router. And so you see a detail of that there. This is also the exhibit, and for me the takeaway was that it was really a collective place, and I think that for me defines the definition of table and is something that you can tap into when you're designing with food systems or food plants or incorporating that into urbanism and architecture. On that theme, this is an image from my master's thesis project where I was studying food systems and the connection between food and architecture. And this is a diagram of the global food system, the agro-industry, local farming, and then foraging. And it's strawberry shortcake made in each of those systems. This is also part of that thesis project where I did some psychogeographic mapping of the embodied experience of being in a landscape of food and foraging for food. So this is smell clouds, you know, walking past sassafras or pawpaw and smelling those foods. And that inspired a design for a farmer's market in Charlottesville. And the farmer's market was a place where food could be foraged and food could be sold, but it was also a place where there was part of the design was a table that was as long as the street. And that was really meant to be a collective space in Charlottesville. So this is a follow-up exhibit that I actually did here in the Keibel Gallery, again called Table in Rome, but this time it was called Forest as Forum. So looking again at landscape and how landscape is connected to public spaces, and kind of testing out a theory that the forest was really the first place for feasting and gathering, and that the form of the forest as a field instead of an object was really the inspiration for the Roman forums and the colonnades and the temples that you see. So although I like doing the kind of small scale, I'm also very interested in architecture. This is an image of a project that I worked on with my partner in Vandergut Lesman Studio. It's a solarium, a kind of warm space in a cold climate. And we used wood as a warm material. It's another project, it's actually a horse barn that my partner and I worked on again together. And it's a really interesting typology because horse barns are not conditioned spaces, which means they don't have a mechanical system, which also means that their structure is totally exposed. And so we had a really fun time using heavy timber construction and really detailing all of the joints because we knew that they would be very visible, not only to the horses who lived there, really nice horse house, but also as a barn that people were using to kind of celebrate and have parties in. So this is an image of a place for viewing the horses. So my office also practices landscape urbanism, and one of the projects that was published in the Third Coast Atlas gets back to Michigan and the Great Lakes. We're looking at a series of shipping locks all along the Great Lakes and trying to redesign the sites of those shipping locks. And so this is an example of one of the 21 shipping locks where we've created a forest of totems that have Wi-Fi and are routed with information. And those totems actually sink when the water of the shipping lock sinks. So in 1 second you can have a forest, and then another second the forest is gone. And then this final slide is what I've been working on really hard lately. A book that I'm working on called Architecture and the Forest Aesthetic, which is looking at a series of case studies in architecture and urbanism that are inspired by the forest.
Excellent. It's really rough being the first one up. I'm just going to line up right now. Anybody that has family that they need to get home to, the moms and dads, Michael Abrams and then Matt Bell are in this batting order so far. Michael, why don't we come on up here? The only one thing I want to say, Yana, is that I really think there was a subtle democratic message in there. Because I don't think that was a horse.
No, it was definitely a donkey. That donkey did live in the barn. It was not one of their like ranching horses.
Hey Brian, there's pizza left here too if people didn't get any pizza. I'm not going to eat all of it.
Matt Bell would like to eat all the pizza if you don't help
There's a
out.
lot
So
of pizza left if people...
somebody, why don't we pass it around, like make an usher
Justin,
here?
have you had any pizza?
We have an usher. Somebody can want to be
It's
an usher.
not
It's the opposite of
Hawaiian.
church. You pass the plate and take some.
Okay. What about
Michael
your
Abrams.
brother?
Michael Abrams is the second contestant on tonight's PechaKucha. Back up here. Let me start again. Messed with my system, didn't you? There you go. You're on.
All right. Hi, welcome. Michael Abrams. I teach Architecture 400. I'm going to give you today's PowerPoint presentation will be mostly on my design process, how I design, and I relate a lot of my architecture to music. I love music. I like to play music, and both I found is both have their own language. Right? There's auditive one, and then the other one is visual, the architectural one. And one thing that I always like to do is look at the similarities between both architecture and music. Now, it all started when I was an undergrad at the University of Puerto Rico. My teacher gave me a project that was to be the place for your hobby. So what I decided to do is to create a space in which to play guitar, which is the instrument I play. And the concept was to reinterpret the components that create the guitar. So I started looking at poetry and philosophers, and I found this great quote by Goethe that talks about petrified music. I call architecture petrified music. Really, there's something in this, the tone of mind. And this whole quote started thinking and how I can start relate architecture in music. And I look at some elements that are very similar, like rhythm, harmony, datum, tension, in which now with those four basic elements, I could start seeing how to relate and become something that's untangible, make it tangible in architecture. So I created this series of diagrams, kind of what my guys are doing right now in 400, looking at rhythm, looking at tension, datum, and that helped me to create this pavilion, this guitar pavilion. That became an important lesson because it helped me to understand what architecture is and how I define it for myself. And to this day, architecture is about space and this spatial experience through a sequence of events. So this project, the whole process of looking into music, understanding it, making something intangible, tangible, helped me to this description that I still use today. And I was able to experiment even further that at the University of Michigan when I did my graduate thesis back in 1988, 1999. And I started looking at other elements, in particular jazz music. Jazz music has a little bit different than regular music, has more improvisation and offbeat rhythm, syncopation. So I was able to kind of explore a bit more into other realms of music within, and then incorporate them into architecture. Here's a few more diagrams that I did for that particular project. This is a music school in which I incorporated kind of this offbeat rhythm into the main auditorium and then the classrooms. So it is all based around the theme and the work of music. Okay. Now, it's only 2 slides, but it took a whole year to work on this. And it's one of my favorite projects ever. Now, in real life, in practice, I was able to incorporate that as well in this competition called the Sound Room. This is in Madrid, in Spain. And this is 2011. And they wanted to hire an architect to design a space for young musicians in Madrid to play their instrument. And right now they're renting all this storage spaces, so they wanted to create a soundproof space. So I started looking at wavelength, and how do you take a simple wavelength that doesn't have a dimension, only one dimension, transform that into a habitable space. in which eventually will become the rehearsal spaces. And I also went back to that first project when I was in Puerto Rico to look at elements of rhythm, datum, tension, to help me to incorporate everything that I've learned so far into this piece of work. So this type of project, it was an enclosed element or shell, so we can only work the interior out. So I decided to take this this habitable sound wave and create it with wood panels, the structural system that will support the 3 rehearsal spaces. And that allowed an interplay of light throughout the day, so the rhythm of light was shown from morning to noon. So you can reflect music through light, and that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this particular project. It got honorary mention, didn't go all the way, but I was very proud of it. We had to do a budget regarding the acoustics and the paneling system. It was truly a labor of love. Then 2 years ago, I did another one, which is called One Site Infinite Solution in Evansville, Indiana. For this one, I actually won the damn thing, so I was very happy. And it was this site in this bad town neighborhood in Evansville, and they wanted to have a space for young musicians to play, and artists to collaborate as well. So I created this is an art center, in which is expressed as a folded piece of architecture that grows from the ground, like the ashes, like the phoenix. And at night, I based it heavily on the Spanish Steps in Rome, so you could still use it at night when the building was closed. Last year, I had the honor to be the chair for 2 students. One of them was Danielle Lander. I wanted to show the stuff that we did together in that thesis. She looked at a pier in Richmond, Philadelphia, and here are the final plans. So she took an abandoned building, and she and I were able to collaborate greatly, because this shared relationship almost becomes like a parent, and you feel for them, you suffer for them, you almost cry for them, but you enjoy the moment. And she took this really bad rundown building and turned it into something positive, something beautiful for the community of Richmond. So she created this beautiful civic community center for artists and young artists to come here and play. So, thank you so much.
Michael, I forgot that you were a musician, and I just want to know if the PechaKucha song is up to scratch for you.
Sure.
Okay.
Next year.
Professor Matt Bell.
I know you don't think I need the microphone, but... Okay, I'm Matt Bell. I start with these 2 slides. I ripped this off from Steve Hurt. Steve Hurt gave a lecture once and he said, fundamentally there's 2 ways to understand architecture. You either understand it via the primitive hut or the individual building, or you understand it via the city. And that you can combine these things, but fundamentally most people sort of see the world and see architecture this way, and they see architectural curriculums either predominantly one way or another way. I'm here to tell you that I'm fundamentally on the left side, but I'm really interested in the extent to which I understand this by understanding that. And that's really the sort of thing that I do, both teaching and in terms of my professional practice, because what I do is I practice architecture at the scale of the city. And this doesn't work properly. It's already set up, he said. You did this to me on purpose, didn't you?
Yeah, I call it turn on.
It helps you be turned on. Is it on?
Just nod.
Okay.
Next slide.
So this is, I think, just back up one, Brian. I think this is yeah, when I say next, okay, this to me was a profound insight, and Steve so often has many profound insights, and it helped me figure out that actually this is a way to both practice and teach architecture. Next. It also, now, yes, next means now. It helped me understand my parents too. I mean, the students who are in Architecture 654 have heard this, you're all bored by it now, but my mother grew up in Brooklyn, and she understood the city, and my father grew up on an estate in a building out in the middle of nowhere, and that's why they never got along, because they never really reconciled their worldviews. And so, as soon as I learned about architecture and urban design, and I understood this paradigm, I understood a lot more about my parents. So study carefully. You never know what might happen in terms of understanding your siblings. But my mother grew up in Brooklyn, and my father grew up on Long Island. And then when my father bought a house, and he put her out in the suburbs, she was unhappy because there was nobody to talk to. And this is a sort of the socialization of the city was an important thing for her, and it was something I began to understand about myself. Next. I went to Rome as an undergraduate. It was the most profound experience I had, studying abroad for 9 months. If you can do this for an extended period of time, you absolutely ought to do it. In my case, Rome was a wonderful place. My teacher that year, I was very fortunate to have him, was Colin Rowe, who had many remarkable things to say. But it was interesting. I thought I was going to Rome to learn the monuments and the great buildings. But in actual fact, I actually learned about the fabric of the city. And what I learned was the relationship of the individual building to how the city works. And I found that it was much more interesting to study the city than it was, and the buildings in it, and how they sit in the city, than it was to study any individual building. And what I learned was, that's not a street, that's an outdoor dining room. And then in Rome's one of these places where the city is much more sort of active and vibrant because it has the possibilities of that. And the sort of propinquity, the sort of business of getting to bump into people and know each other because you're in a city and near each other, to me has always been a very profound way of learning about life and architecture, and that's one of the things I try to do in both teaching and practicing. Next, please. I went there and taught there for a number of years, started the Rome program with Brian and Tom Schumacher. This is Brian and I when we were just a tad bit thinner a number of years ago. This is the late Tom hypnotizing students in front of one of the Tirani buildings, but I enjoyed teaching architecture in sight, whether it's going to Washington, D.C. or going to Italy, because it's really fun to stand there and talk about things and see things and draw them in situ. And it's really an experience I think all you really ought to take advantage of. Next. I sponsor things like the Heinz ULI competition, which is an interdisciplinary urban design competition with urban design students, architecture students, planning, real estate, landscape architecture, and we've won it twice. And we beat about 140 teams each time. And the provost and the president really noticed when one of the teams you beat is Harvard. And we beat Harvard twice in a row, which is really nice. And we have some really wonderful students here, and this has been one of the great wonderful teaching things for me here at Maryland is doing this competition. I've learned an immense amount, and I really enjoy the interaction with folks. Next. And then some of the things we do, and this is some of the boards from the Heinz competition, and some of the things we've been doing lately with the PALS program in terms of doing urban design projects in some of these municipalities. This is Frederick, Maryland, in and around the area. You folks have an enormous amount of energy and insight and passion, and the thinking you bring to these kinds of projects is extraordinary. And the people in Frederick were blown away by what our students came up with, and it gave them a kind of way of looking at their city that they couldn't easily get themselves. It's an outsider's view, but a very sophisticated view. And even if they don't implement everything we came up with, just the way of seeing it was extraordinarily important to them. So if you can have that kind of experience while you're here at Maryland, you should try and do so. Next. These are some of the images. This is a Philadelphia project we did. Got some nice prizes for this in studio, looking at the waterfront. Next. I've been involved with the Castellamare di Stabia, the Stabia project, more doing some urban design projects, but also helping with the archaeological projects. How many folks have been recently? We'll be with one. Good. It's not good. No more than that. But it's been a fun project because it's involved all sorts of different things, from classical archaeology to urban design to landscape gardening and landscape architecture. And this was all started, by the way, with a University of Maryland master's degree students. So millions of dollars of resources have been brought to bear to record, analyze, understand this site, and it all started with a master's degree thesis project, which was sort of mushroomed into a great undertaking. So the sort of things you guys do and you're interested in can have incredible repercussions. And what this did is it brought this site back to the world, because everybody had forgotten about it. And it's the site right near Pompeii. It's the largest collection of Republican-era Roman villas in the world. And they're really fantastic to study and document. Next. Professionally, these are 4 people that I worked for and learned a lot from early in my career. Shalom Baranis, one of the best sort of businessmen architects you'll find. Did a number of projects early in my career with Andres Duani. Andres Duani is one of the smartest people I have ever met. And anything he says about architecture and urban design, you really should think about, because he's very insightful. John Torty knows more about housing and running, how to mentor people in an architecture practice than anybody I've ever met. And Stan Eckstead, my partner with EEK, now Perkins Eastman, where I practice, is I think one of the most original thinkers in terms of urban design and architecture at the scale of the city. Number of projects I've done early in my career. Buildings with Shalom Baranis Associates, which were office buildings, and with John Torty, a big project in Turkey, next, which was built actually, which was kind of amazing on this hillside. The people in other parts of the world will put buildings in places Americans never would. This was all 15% slopes and things, and it made for some tremendous sections in the buildings and in the urban fabric. Okay, coming up on, keep going. Brookland Manor, a project on Rhode Island Avenue that will start construction next year. This is a project we did next. Berry Farm, another big urban design project in Southeast Washington. Keep going. Some buildings I've done, a community center in Northeast Washington and Dunbar High School, and we make these kind of urban design drawings to show how the parts of the building relate to the context around them. So it's really important when you get down to the scale of the building to show how it relates to the city. Next. Project I've been working on for years, the McMillan Project on North Capitol Street, which will be rebuilding a historic landmark site that involves many different things. I think for me, next slide, is a question of, we know the errors of modern architecture and modern urbanism. We need to repair them. I find this kind of architecture that makes the magazines today really kind of ridiculous at one point. I think architects don't have to shout at you to get attention and to do good in a neighborhood. And while a building like this might be a great engineering feat, I'm not sure what it does for the community around it. Next. And then these are my heroes. I think it's always important for people to know who your heroes are. These are my heroes as architects and designers. Next. The cities I would look at, and Brian, I think will make this available to you. I think it's always good to look at cities and buildings. Next. And the people I would read. And these are some of the people that were very influential in my career in terms of writings in it. And in particular, Tom Schumacher, who used to teach here. And if you get a hold of something Tom's written, you should read it, because it's some of the most insightful things about architecture I think I've ever read by anybody. And that's that. Oh, things I would know. Typology, these are just other stuff. Anyway.
Our next contestant, who wants to be next? Who's chomping? Professor Ambrose, the next family man here. That's right, I'm sorry.
Brian, are you going to make these available to people?
Well, there's a video that'll be on YouTube. And so you can, if you've missed any portion of this, you can go back and tune back in on it and be all excited and enjoy it again and again and again. You can show your friends, you can go home with your family and do it. You ready to go?
The city versus the primitive site. It's very important.
Okay, hi, I'm Michael Ambrose. I primarily targeted this towards the thesis students to kind of introduce some of my ideas, thoughts, architectures, and concepts that I find personally interesting, and those are the kinds of ideas I'm interested in working with thesis students on. I also, at some point here, I'll read 5 recommendations I have for those of you entering the thesis prep semester. I fundamentally view architectural thesis and architecture studio in general as primary role of representation. Architecture is fundamentally an act of representation. We represent our ideas. We translate our ideas into visual communication. It's the shorthand we talk to each other. It's the way in which our works are understood. So I'm going to highlight a series of issues. Process. I think process is fundamentally important to the way you conduct your thesis, the way you conduct yourself. And it's fundamental to the way I teach and try to engage students to think about deconstructing any one issue into a range of ways of thinking about an issue rather than focusing on a singular solution, trying to promote a range of ways of thinking about things. This leads to a fundamental area of my interest is design thinking. I think design thinking is something that architects have done since the beginning of time. It's now an emergent discipline of its own. But it's the way in which you break down a problem, the way you define a problem, the way you ask really good questions before jumping into solutions, again, to think about how am I understanding the problem, how am I defining it. And again, representation, how I attack that as a student, how I attack that as an architect is based on what the diagram looks like, what the idea looks like, what the question looks like, and how I frame that and communicate that to my peers and ultimately to the public. So this is an image that was important when I was a student. This was by Tom Main and Morphosis for a project that was later built. I'm also interested in the digital, and I believe that digital things can be crafted. One might think, and this quote talks about digital craft being an oxymoron, that craft is knowingly something made with the hand, it's something that's made with the touch. But I believe that craft is really an act of the mind. I believe that drawing is an act of the mind, not an act of the pencil. Whether you're drawing with pencil or you're drawing with pixels, you have to be, again, raising those representational questions. It leads to products like this and thinking like this. This is a project by Foreign Office Architects. And it's really an essay and poetry about lines, radii, points, tangent, and the way in which an architecture could emerge from a logic of line making, a logic of representation of those ideas. And so the product of architecture is important as the process. And this quote by Alberti, which my students hear me repeat again and again, is really about visual making. He talks about, and this is in 1492, he's confronting what many of you are confronting in the studio. I have a great idea, but every time I try to draw it or model it or show it to my faculty, it doesn't work out quite as well as I thought. And that's in part the perpetual study of architecture, and I think that's what makes architectural design studios so exciting. I think the fundamental language of architecture is one of geometry, and the better you understand geometry and the better you can break a formal or spatial problem down to a geometric problem, the better able you are to study that through representation, drawing, and thinking. And this is a project by Cecil Balmond at the Arab Group, looking at compound curve geometries and the way they can form a self-structural shell. I'm also interested in questions of the city. I participate in the Education Abroad program to Rome, and I think that Rome and the Noli Plan and the streets, everything Professor Bell just mentioned, is incredibly important, and you need to understand that. You need to travel and experience as many places as possible. I think the questions of the city are fundamental to the way architects have to view the world, that's the real problem we're trying to solve. But the questions of the city aren't just existing in the Noli Plan. They aren't existing in the past. The city of Hong Kong here is contemporary urbanism. It's where the real questions of the city lie today. And many places like this are being built at such a rampant pace that there's not consideration of the traditions or the values or the spaces or the outdoor rooms that Professor Bell was just talking about. And we need to think about that. This is an area of research that I've been conducting for the last several years called digital conceptions, where we talk about the preconceptions of digital craft, the misconceptions of digital craft, and the reconceptions of the design process that emerge from that exploration and that line of inquiry. So I'm really interested in projects that are interested in the conceptualization of architecture and the development of a space or form. So while these images are inspirational architects and architecture to me, I'm going to read my 5 points of thesis help. Number 1, pick a topic that extends or overlaps with a project you already have completed. Thesis is a time to push something you love farther than you ever pushed it before. It should be an architectural idea or concept that provokes you to action. Number 2, find 10 projects quickly that are by other people that address your topic or interest directly. If this task is difficult or takes more than 2 hours, your topic probably isn't working for you. Number 3, make sure your thesis statement implies a way to act. If you feel stuck at the onset, then your thesis isn't focused enough. You should be making beautiful, exciting work that simultaneously inspires and or confounds you immediately. Relatedly, don't spend too much time talking, mapping, or outlining what you plan to do. Just do something now and then respond to it later. Make, think, and repeat. Number 4, start small and expand. Do Do not start broad and assume that at some other point later on you will quote-unquote produce a quote-unquote project. That won't work. Starting by example, designing or studying a doorknob would be a fine way to start a project. Starting by example, rethinking how the discipline of architecture, world peace, or hunger and or poverty can be conceived relative to an immeasurable existential notion rooted in another discipline will be a disaster. Number 5, some of the most important conversations you will have about your thesis will be with non-architects. Make sure you can always explain what you're doing to someone else outside the discipline and make sure it makes sense to them. And I think if you do that, always focused on these 2 concepts. What are we doing with space and how are we doing that with form? And you start to ask architectural questions and you start to respond with architectural values like representation, design process, inquiries into the city, questions about the city. I think that your architecture will start to emerge. I think that as you develop your thesis projects and the kind of things I hope to talk about next week at the thesis match event are around the topics of design thinking, digital craft, visual making, and the digital conceptions that I talked about. I think all of these things that we generally think about in architecture are all about creative thinking. They're about looking at a situation and reimagining what if. What if we thought about this differently? What if there wasn't a restraint on us? What if I could change the world? And I think that's a big question and a big thing that architecture can actually do. And so what I'm looking for is trying to express myself and trying to find students that are interested in expressing that critical thinking, that creative thinking. And I often think of the story of Perseus. Before Perseus knocked off Medusa's head, he had to be very creative and think of a way to get around the situation. And those of you that know the myth of Perseus understand the creative thinking that went into this image. And those of you that don't know the myth of Perseus, I hope you go home and Google it tonight, and understand what's creative thinking about the slaying of Medusa.
Thank you, Professor Ambrose. And in fact, I want to underscore a point. So Professor Ambrose said he was directing his comments towards the people engaged in thesis. And I would assert that all of us are engaged in thesis. So right now, those of you in first year studio, I think you might want to start asking yourselves, what is the thesis of the project I'm working on? Those of you in level 2 studio, what is the thesis of the project I'm working on? Those of you in the comprehensive, the integrated design studio, what is the thesis? What is the idea behind the project that I'm working on? Those of you in the urban design studio, in every studio along the way, I think you could be asking that question, what is the idea? And when you actually get to the course called thesis, I think you'll be a much happier camper because you'll have thought about that along the way. Peter Noonan, would you like to come up and be the next contestant? Excellent. There we go.
So that's a nice segue, Brian, your description of addressing this idea of thesis to all the students. This talk is about our lives as a thesis and how we approach architectural education. And so I want to talk about 5 educations that those of you that might be freshmen or sophomore or finishing your thesis or just finished your thesis might approach this idea of how you engage in architecture education. So the first education is the one we're all aware of, the academic education. So from the first initial studios where you might be just learning about this idea of composition and abstraction, or that's the education that we're all engaged in right now. And I think up through your thesis, these are some images of my thesis, you have an obligation and an opportunity to begin to define what architecture is to yourself. You've heard of the Vitruvian or tripartite definition of firmness and commodity and delight. I think as you approach your academic education, you have an obligation to yourself to make a personal definition of what architecture is. For me, it became this pairing of words, ritual and place, what we do and where we do it, and how we make our place in the world. The second education I want to talk about is travel and journey. We spent hours and days and weeks in this building, and I really want to encourage everyone to get out of the building. You can go to Rome or Paris or Turkey. You can go to Scandinavia. And I went to Scandinavia like Matt went to Rome, looking for the heroic and kind of the mountaintop and the heroes of my architectural and academic education. But what I really came away with from that experience was this idea of an inhabited landscape and how you engage with the world and make plays. And you don't have to go to Denmark. You can go over to the Pope Leahy House. You don't have to go to Stockholm. You can go down to Charlottesville. You can go to Philadelphia or Washington. So you don't have to travel far to get these experiences. The third education I want to talk about is construction. Knowing how things go together. I would put myself more at the spectrum of the primitive hut in Matt's example than the city. I'm very interested in tectonics and how things go together. Sometimes you can combine these educations. You can be a recent graduate student and go up to the shores of a lake in Finland and build a smoke sauna over the summer. So you can combine construction and travel after an academic education and engage in that idea of furthering one's education. And that can continue in practice in how you make drawings or make large-scale models or engage with craftspersons in making a place where ritual dinners can happen. And so combining these ideas together is important. The fourth education would be this idea of practice. Practice in two definitions of the word. Professional practice. Practicing as a professional, listening to your clients, working with your team. But also this idea of practice in kind of the athletic sense or the repetitive sense. So you might think of architecture as kind of calisthenics. And if you don't exercise this design muscle every day, you're not going to get good at it. So it's not just kind of inspiration, but it's also hard work. And how you think about putting stairs together over the years is a way to think about this iterative act. Engaging with a large community and bringing these four educations into practice is important. One of the best emails I ever got was from the owners of the Somerset Pool who said they just loved the way that building was the beating heart of their town. You can combine the ideas of the entire city into one building and engage in commerce at the street and work on a second floor and dwelling and living up in these 6 apartments that we located in an adaptive reuse project in Georgetown. And there are a lot of different team members in putting this project together through professional practice. And then finally, I'd like to talk about scale. This is a house that's 11 feet wide next to a 14-foot wide house that we did. And this is a project that's just finishing up that I'm going to be taking the 600 students out to in the next couple of weeks. That you could probably fit, I don't know, hundreds of those in. The fifth education is what I'm doing up here and what some of the recent thesis students are doing in the 400 studio, where teaching itself is that fifth education. And so we learn quite a bit from engaging with you in the studios, or we get to dive deep into topics that we're interested in. So I'm interested in this connection between film and place, or this idea of a full engagement of the senses through making and experiencing architecture. And so our seminars are ways to dive deep into special topics. And then finally, bringing this thing full circle back to the students' thesis projects, and to build on what Michael was saying, the thesis is an opportunity for you guys to really develop this full definition for yourselves of what architecture means for you, and to go very deep into a topic that's special for you. And finally, I believe that to be a good architect, to be a good citizen, you need to lead a full life and a balanced life. So between the demands of teaching and practice, try and engage in that full life. Thank you.
So could we have Josh Hill next as a participant? Josh.
Hi everybody, I'm Joshua Hill. I'm teaching 402 this semester. And today I want to talk about, so what's the big idea? And any of my students know that this is something I ask, this thesis question, what's the big idea, every time I see any drawing that they've done. I think it's very important that we focus on things that we draw and things that we design and know that they have to support this idea we have. So I was here at Maryland for 6 years. We did some great charrettes, lots of study abroads, highly encourage that. Some events which may have involved the Beaux-Arts Ball and some identities which have been modified. But basically, you know, everything we did here came back to support how to develop ideas. Now, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Garlic Coca-Cola. Okay, not all ideas are great ideas, and it's important that if you have an idea, you should develop it, think about it, and vet it. Because while you need to have ideas, they should be well thought out and well vetted. So I want to show you guys just some projects and some buildings that I've loved over time that have given me inspiration. So I was in Mexico last year. This is Isla Holbox off the northern coast of the Yucatan. And everywhere I turned, there were primitive huts. It was sort of like great, but distracting at the same time, because I'm looking at this very simple structure with the, with the 4 columns and then the sloped roof and the basic big idea shelter. And they take this and morph it into, okay, you can make a tower out of this, you can make a little cocktail table, you can make a restaurant. But to take that basic, simple, big idea, shelter, and just really run with it was really, really interesting to see that. And of course, the vernacular all over the island. This, of course, is L'Enfant's plan for Washington. And, this big idea about the mall being this space for the people that connects the legislative and the executive kind of on equal bearing. But it never really fully developed. And, I don't know if you guys have heard about the principle of the second man, but the idea of taking this idea and developing it further. So the Macmillan Plan, 1901, really took, during the City Beautiful movement, really took that idea that never actually developed, but really started to put space making back on the mall to connect the executive and the legislative branch and to really make a really big move, a really bold, powerful idea. This, of course, is Temple of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry on 16th Street in DC. I really hope that everyone here knows this building, and everyone, before they leave this building, will come to this building. It's amazing inside. But the clarity of the idea that this building is really about this room. You can see this large colonnade, this volume, you know it's there. There's that symbol on the outside, you're drawn in underneath that room when you enter. These heavy columns that support this, the beams and the ceiling and the light that draws you back, you can feel the weight of that room as you walk underneath it. And then as you're pulled up, as that light pulls you up inside of the room, you reconnect with that symbol that you saw on the outside of the building. And you get to experience this big, beautiful, wonderful room. And of course, it's about the room and it's about the procession into that room, which I really think is just a wonderful and really simple idea. Another building that certainly expresses a big space on the outside, because a very different style of architecture, the Guggenheim in New York. And one of the things I've always loved about this building is how you see that space and it sort of looks like a spaceship landed on the street, and you don't really even understand it. You go in, and of course it's also about the procession, except for the elevators take you up, and then it really becomes about that experience. So the experience of kind of seeing people in the space, seeing the art, moving down through the building, and it's really wonderful. I was actually there a couple weekends ago, and just to kind of feel the vibe of that interaction of people kind of in the space and understanding it, is really wonderful. And it's sort of, for me, segues into the next one, which is Cloud Gate in Chicago. Has everybody been here? Let's see a show of hands. The beam, which is great because for me it's about the interaction between this polished object and how it morphs these beautiful surroundings, but then it also really becomes more about how people interact with it. And just kind of that, once again, this big, clear idea, right? This thing is just going to be about how how people interact with it, how people walk up, take their pictures and their selfies and get underneath of it and look up. And for me, it's just a really, once again, really kind of clear, big idea that it's really about the interaction of this thing in the park. Shard Cathedral, which, you know, I think Gothic cathedrals have always been especially interesting to me because, you know, the technology of the Gothic era really allowed, you know, with flying buttresses, it really allowed these buildings to become so much taller. And in a way that they've done that with, you know, this heavy kind of, you know, stone, but that yet it's well, that's terribly pixelated. But it's, you know, it's really kind of light and airy at the same time. But these repetitive elements that lead down to this axis, and it almost feels oppressive in a way, while still feeling inspiring. It's very interesting. And the other kind of, I guess the other part of that is that, you know, comparing this to the Salk Institute, which is, if you haven't been to the Salk Institute, you have to go. It's really just absolutely beautiful. But it's an interesting parallel because it's a similar set of repetitive elements. But here, you don't really feel, you don't feel small in the eyes of God. You maybe feel small in the eyes of the world. You look out to the ocean and you realize that there's a whole ocean, a whole world out there. Another one of my absolute favorite buildings, Pennsylvania Station in New York City, which of course is not here anymore, but designed by McKinley & White, and a really cool idea about bringing the Pennsylvania Railroad into Manhattan. It was very difficult to do, to bring these tunnels in. But the idea here, the big idea, is that this building was designed in order to, when you came into the greatest city in the world, that you were meant to feel like a king. You were meant to feel like royalty coming into the greatest city. And, you know, Basil Caracalla was studied in Rome, lots of Roman public buildings. But just, once again, this great big idea. We're going to make this the best, the most grand building in the world. And this is what it looks like today if you haven't been there. And I will just leave you with this quote, because it's about a different idea. But from Vincent Scully, one entered the city like a god, one scuttles in now like a rat. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. It is always a pleasure to see the 33rd and final temple of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry for the southern jurisdiction of the rest of the world, and the rest of the world, by John Russell Pope in 1915. Okay, Ming, I've got you on.
This will be, first I have to say, this will be my first PechaKucha, okay? So be gentle. Okay, so I'm interested in the intersection of building system and green technology. So because I like to work on large scale and complicated building. During the process, not only I can learn from my architect peers, I also learn a lot from my engineer fellows. And also I start to know, at the same level, they got paid a little bit more than me, so I got to wonder, why is that? And why they can work less while get paid more but work less. And my conclusion is they can quantify their value much better, and they can communicate their value to the clients and us much better. And this is when I decide to, whatever I do, no matter if it's design or research, I want to take the quantitative approach. So my interest is in building system. You might think building system includes a lot, right? Structure, mechanic, and smart facade, and the double skin. All of those are building system. And green technology also includes a lot. Software is a type of technology, and the green wall is technology, as well as the smart glass and smart material. And this is type of design technology we used 30 years ago or 40 years ago. At that time, it's green, and then nowadays, you all probably use at least 3 different type of tool to help you do your design. And also use another 3 or 5 different software help you to do the building's performance simulation. So there's a lot, and I want to, and so probably you still have the question, what exactly you are interested in. So I'm going to show you the 4 focus area I have been conducted research for several years till right now. First is smart and advanced building materials. Second is net zero building, and facade design. Third is life cycle assessment and adaptive reuse. Last one is decision-making model and integrated design process. Next, I'm going to take you through some of my projects to show you how I always try to blend those four aspects together. But because most of the time you cannot separate those four. The first project I'm going to show you is a competition project we won and we did as a team in 2013. And we proposed to clad the entire facade with algae tube. Yes, algae grew inside of tube. Not only it can produce the energy and electricity, also can depollute the air. Another interesting part of this competition, again, is a collaborative discipline teamwork. Another interesting aspect of this building is atrium design. The inspiration is from the nature, and see the Cantaloupe Canyons not only has the amazing fascinating form and texture, but also it's a fantastic daylight system. So we get an inspiration from the nature, try to recreate the natural phenomenon in our building. So basically by manipulating the geometry of the atrium, try to maximize the daylight at the same time and minimize the solar heat gain. This is an overview. It's not a good picture, but this is give you an overview on, say, the entire design proposal. This is it's a project located in a harsh climate, Abu Dhabi, and the client asked us to provide fully glazed facade, which is not a great idea. So we use the smart facade, smart window, smart glazing can provide shelf shape to itself. This is another project in Doha, Qatar, another harsh climate. So this time we take the lessons we learn from the traditional building and learn from the vernacular building. Instead of glazed facade, we use this natural stone, local natural stone, and focus on to design the best punch window. So we studied a lot of the geometry of the punch window as well as the material of the glazing, different glazing type. By going through the simulation, going through the iteration, we probably do 50 iterations in 3 days just to compare different design options. And here shows you the particular geometry of this punch window. It's not a regular punch window. And also we did a lot of study of different frit pattern and the different techniques, how you integrate the frit inside of the glazing. We do this almost like a second nature of the design process from the conceptual design stage all the way to design development. So basically compare the design option. I think the green technology means the smart technology can help you to reach the optimized decision or design solution in the short period of time. And here shows you the different study of the sun shape. Last one is the particular part I have developed interest in recent couple of years, life cycle analysis and adaptive reuse. For me, it's a natural progression because I'm always interested in quantitative high performance design and also smart material. That leads me to think about the entire life cycle of a building. Not only how much the energy the building will consume during the operational stage, but also actually how much energy will building consume from the day one, those raw material being dug out from the ground to the last day, those components being put back to the earth, to our planet. And I do believe that will be the future trend of our architecture design and research. Not only we focus on the building we live in right now, but also before and after. And this is a project my student did. They provide the adaptive reuse proposal. And at the same time, I did the life cycle analysis of 3 different options. Again, I think the future of architecture as a profession is going to expand beyond just the design. As the former speaker, the presenter said, we do a lot of design thinking as well. We do quantitative research as well.
Thank you, Meg. I mean, I would have thought you probably had done many of these before. It sounded just like you had. Next is Lindsay May.
Hi, I'm Lindsay May. So I'm going to, as any good thesis, set up a tiny 6.5-minute historical trajectory and humbly insert myself into the end of it. Architecture, I think, is public and political inherently. It's a public act, it's public facing. This is the most important building I ever learned about. I got to go there this summer. It's in Berlin. It's by Karl Friedrich Schinkel. It was built in 1830, and it was one of the first purpose-built museums. So the architect had to say, oh, museum for the public. That's a new thing. How do I do it? So you remember the plaza? He basically brought the plaza in to the building, inflected, so this is the museum, physically inflected the building with the plaza. So the public is pushing, the public space is pushing up over the stairs, filtered through a colonnade and up onto a second level terrace, which looks back out over the public plaza. So it's this full circle of public space that's woven into and knitted into the private space. Moreover, quickly look at all the scale figures, which are teaching people that look at this image how to use the building. So not only is the building an instructional device for the museum and public space, but the representation also teaches and reinforces that. This is a photo from that corner. You can actually see out the building does come in. They put in glass, which is unfortunate, but I guess necessary for quantitative reasons. It's still, in the next image you'll be able to see, you really do feel a connection with the plaza, and it works exactly how the image, the kind of rendering illustration shows, and exactly how the building massing shows. So for me, this was an educational revelation to learn about. It's leverages a private program off of public space. Similarly, this is the High Line, so fast forward approximately just under 200 years for my historical trajectory. This is the High Line in New York, which most of you probably know about. It took an abandoned elevated rail line and leveraged that public space and leveraged the city and developers into making a space for the public. So this is the found condition. There's supposed to be another kind of overgrown image, but there's nature, there's industrial elements, there's traces of human interaction, and this was the site. And I think it's important to remember now, everyone thinks of the High Line as like, of course, the High Line, there's a million in every city, but these are studies on what to do, whether to tear it down. It's not an inevitable building or public space type, but like the Altes Museum, the High Line and architecture in general, I argue, has the ability to leverage and change people's expectations of how they get to live in their city. So, for example, new types of leisure in the city. This is not a normal thing. Hovering above traffic, looking at traffic is relaxation. Lounging on a lounge chair in the city. These are totally novel ways to live in the city, and you might be thinking, of course big public projects are public and political. They take up half the city. But I would argue that also Philip Johnson's Glass House is a great example of, at the domestic scale, you can even scale down. This is still a public space, or a public statement about domesticity, about living, even object scale. These are Bauhaus and Eileen Gray objects, incorporating the machine and industrialization into the domestic life. I think all these objects and buildings are examples of how design and architecture and industrial design can make political and public statements and teach us how to live. So I'm going to kindly insert myself into this trajectory. This is my graduate thesis. I'm not going to show any professional work I've done. If you want to talk about that stuff, you can come grab me sometime. But I looked at East Midtown Manhattan, which is kind of a downtown corporate area, and looked at all these totally empty, horribly used lobby spaces. So I actually walked around and mapped them all out. This is the neighborhood. The city was looking at rezoning it anyway, so I kind of had this momentum to work on. This is how much of the city is on the ground floor, right next to the sidewalk, but blocked off and not used. The other map was a precedent of privately owned public spaces, so looking at how the city is already knitting together public and private space. So that's the kind of big context. In the immediate context, this is the lobby. It's excessively designed in every way. The structure within the scale of the lobby is like overly robust. Electricity, facade materials, all these things are integrated already in the lobby, and I looked at the ways that architecture could rethink that with the materials that are there and intervene to make public space and a public network of lobbies through public-private partnerships and leveraging private interest in the city for public space. This is an example I did in the Seagram building, looking at, through manipulating the facade, making mezzanines off the structure, and looking at how to consolidate circulation, that this large space, and this is not even the largest lobby in East Midtown, how the bottom of the Seagram building can really take that plaza that's there and bring it back in. I think another part, going back to the representation from the Altes Museum, it's really about finding the representation and study methods. So these are stills from a video I did as part of my thesis with a cinematographer documenting. I made a book and presented in competition. So it was really about finding the vehicles for my project that I thought worked best, with the idea of hopefully making a neighborhood that was more robust and resilient and interconnected. Thanks.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Who does it next? Brittany or Carl? Carl Bovel? Next is Carl Bovel. Professor Carl Bovel.
I'd like to talk about a way of seeing, and you have to ask yourself why is that a pleasant image? And what it comes down to is self-similarity. This person, Vinod Mandelbrot, wrote this book. It's around 1970, and he brought together self-similar mathematical shapes and related them to nature and showed that nature is self-similar. I think this is kind of a neat image. You wonder whether the forests of Northern Europe had something to do with Gothic architecture and the shapes that it took. He talks about clouds are not spheres, and mountains are not cones. And if you look at self-similarity here, you see how that and this thing and this piece sort of echo each other. You know, coastlines are not circles. It wouldn't be fun to climb around on all those rocks. It was just a circular shape. And bark is not smooth. This is a redwood tree. If you look at all the tubular stuff there, there's layers of tubular stuff that goes deep into the bark. And nor does lightning travel in a straight line. You know, look at the secondary pieces and how similar they are to the main thrust. The best way to look at self-similarity in nature is with trees. This is a poplar tree and an oak tree. And if you look at this, there's another poplar tree here, and there's another one here, and there's another one up above. Trees know how to grow in a certain fashion. Here's two. I don't know what kind of trees these are, but they're clearly the same species, but they're not the same. You know, you can see the similarity in the echo, the repeating structure, but they're not the same. If all oak trees were exactly the same, it would be a little bit boring, wouldn't it? You know, so why then do we have facades that are exactly the same and repeat? They'd be much more interesting if they echo the complexity of the forest. And why do we like, this is Main Street in Nantucket. Why do we like that? Because of the variability. My favorite skyscraper has a crescendo of self-similarity that goes up at the top. If you go in close, it even has bark. You know, if you look at a Greek temple, a Doric temple, if you do a fractal analysis of it, it's real clear that the triglyphs are little small images of the whole temple. And actually the columns, if you squeeze it this way, are also images of the whole temple. If, you know, this is a tree turned upside down compared to the a drainage pattern for a river, and you can see the same kind of shapes. You know, so nature all over is self-similar and repeats itself. I'm going to go back. Sorry, I went too fast. I just discovered this at Sea Ranch this summer. Waves come in onto the coast with these big curves, and if you look closely, there's little curves on top of that, and there's little curves on top of the little curves. I don't know why it does that, but it's kind of neat. You know, this shape was on the beach. I don't know why this happened, but it was like water running off of the sand, and you can see the big stuff and the little stuff underneath it. It's very much like bark. There's multiple layers of self-similar shape. This is a post office on Church Circle in Annapolis, and you know, again, self-similarity. There's three main pieces to the shape. There's three main windows in the middle. The window here has three pieces to it. The mountains make three pieces to the windows. Just like in the Greek temple, when you go up, the self-similarity gets smaller, but there's still three pieces. The main window is a little bit more important, just like it is down here. You go up even further, and there's openings in the parapet. You know, there's a stone sill there and another stone sill up above. Just like in nature, when you go in on stuff, there's interest. Buildings should be the same way. From the distance it's interesting, from mid-ground it's interesting. When you come right up to the front door, it's a really neat front door, and there's a really neat handle to open the front door. And then urban areas, walkable neighborhood centers connected by streetcars and buses to the main urban center and connected to the other urban centers through rapid transit. So again, self-similarity, building. And then finally, I'd like to point out, once you learn to see self-similarity, you will open up the curiosity of your mind's eye in seeing what's around you. Thank you.
Carl, is it possible that that form on the beach that you had just discovered, the first evidence of alien life form, and it somehow slipped by us all? Excellent. Our next presenter is Brittany Williams.
So I'm not going to talk about burning rubber, the road trip to the world's largest rubber stamp. I know you might be disappointed. I'm also not going to talk about my trip to the world's largest pistachio nut in New Mexico, or when I got frostbite in China at the world's largest ice festival. All of the locals laughed at me. And by the way, this isn't edible, so don't go there. It's not worth it. But I am going to talk about how we as people are the sum of our parts. And, you know, our experiences shape us as designers. Everything that you do shapes you as a designer. And lots of times we orchestrate these kinds of events, like your thesis, like going to college. But a lot of the times these things happen and they just happen to you. But you can orchestrate events that will increase this. So you go to an art exhibit, you see a piece of artwork, it changes your life. And so I think for me, traveling is the biggest thing that helps me unlock these doors, that I can really feel the way that my worldview is shaped through traveling. And so I try and set up as many experiences as possible to invite that kind of experience. And so traveling is particularly important to me. My partner is a commercial airline pilot, and so her career kind of unlocks doors for me. I can show up at the airport and get on the plane like it's a bus. And so that really enables me to take advantage of this and really unlock that door and travel as much as possible so that I can provide myself with as many opportunities to change my worldview. And so when I'm traveling, I'm really interested in dwelling and how we dwell. And so in professional practice, I'm really interested in craft and context and environmental response. So that's something that I'm looking for when I'm traveling. And I really want to find the ways that other cultures and other people combine these things together to kind of create a contextual response. And in academics, you guys probably know these projects. As a graduate student, I worked on Leaf House, and I was one of the faculty advisors for Watershed, so it's the same kind of ideas. And the reason that I'm so interested in how we dwell is that it's a simple thing, shelter. It's a universal need that we've needed for thousands of years, but the diversity of solutions, and there's so many things that impact those. Economics, culture, climate, water access, and you name it, it's something that kind of impacts how we dwell. And so traveling to precedents, people have said this before, you know, the need to go and experience places and understand the scale and the context and the smell of the place. So going to, you know, famous dwellings to really understand them and their place in the world. And so I'm also interested in the vernacular. I was in Zambia in Africa this past summer, and I became obsessed with the sort of primitive hut, using the local materials that were found nearby. And the reason that why they were creating these kinds of housing types was really, really particularly fascinating to me. And they were all over the place. And so I'm also interested in materiality and building craft. You know how building with tile here in China is actually kind of cheap, and the masons and the builders know how to build with a tile roof. But then if you try and do that in the United States, it's very expensive. No one knows how to do it. So trying to figure out, you know, why materials are of their place. And I'm not just interested in the famous stuff, as you know. The vernacular is also interesting, and so is what's happening now. So I went around in Beijing taking photos of all different color housing that they had. They just had the same apartment building, but it was just painted different colors all over the place. I'm also interested in how we can make community in housing. This is the Linked Hybrid project in Beijing, and it's kind of testing out a new idea of making community spaces within the building, within a housing development, and not just focused on creating housing or community within the city. And also, of course, water and waste, the everyday. You know, everything about how we dwell differs from culture to culture, and how there's like social implications for how we use toilets. That's my, when I was living in Beijing, that was my bathroom, and the shower head is directly over the toilet. But there's something to be learned from those efficiencies. And I also think there's a lot to be learned from, you know, traveling to places and going to see innovations and prototyping. I was at the Chicago Architecture Biennial this past winter, and this is a affordable housing strategy where they took pallets and put them together to make sustainable housing. I'm also interested in sustainable motivations. You know, when you go to lots of European countries, South America, you see everyone has solar thermal, and it's no big deal. That's the standard thing. Then you come to the U.S., and that's something that's special. Or, you know, people recycle in other places because you have to recycle. So, meanwhile, back home, none of the images are showing up. But, so I take all of those things as both direct and indirect influences, and they kind of change my worldview in ways in which some of them I'm aware and some of them I'm not aware, but it all becomes part of my consciousness as I'm working as a professional and as an academic and just as a person. So you can orchestrate events to change your life, to create life-changing experiences, but to me it's really that unexpected that has the biggest impact. To kind of create these experiences where you might experience life-changing events. So taking advantage of those opportunities. So you might say, well, there's so much to be learned from the everyday world around you. So say yes to those new and diverse experiences. Go to the lecture. You might hear a quote that will change your life. Go see an art installation. You don't need to travel across the world in order to have a life-changing experience. And then once you're there, observe, 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 observe. All of this you're observing and taking in really is changing your worldview and helping you as a person. So again, a whole bunch of images not showing up. But next time, I didn't talk about the world's largest experience this time, but maybe next time I'll tell you about the world's largest outdoor bronze seated Buddha statue. And I'm available afterwards if you want to talk about the world's largest truck stop.
Thank you very much. So next is Dr. Cynthia Field.
Okay, some of you haven't met me. I have my PhD from Columbia University, where I studied Daniel Hudson Burnham's city planning, all about City Beautiful, and I spoke to one of the studios recently about that. I also had the opportunity to be a special student up at Harvard, where my husband was taking his doctorate, and I had previously gained my master's at Columbia, working on the Chicago Tribune competition. So this wide range of historical interests, and my ongoing interest in cities and city planning. My undergraduate dissertation was on a comparison of city planning from Leonardo to the contemporary. Yeah, okay. So let me show you a few of my special subjects that I like. Almost all architecture, but also city planning. Yeah, I love the Watergate. That is really a phenomenal, it's so Italian, and it's really underappreciated. The building museum is in a spectacular building, if you have not seen it, and the cathedral is something, it's just a building that talks to me. I would go in it and it just speaks. I'm very interested in teamwork. I've always done, I do my own scholarship, but I work in teams. These are two publications that resulted from that. Paris on the Potomac, I'm teaching a course now relating to that. I worked with Professor Gournay and another scholar on that. It's a collection of essays about French influence. Here, you see some of the images that reflect my scholarship in the history of Washington. I've really spent a lot of time on the planning of Washington. And I'm also interested in German influence in Washington. This is a spectacular building still with us, and this gentleman is a German architect and engineer on whom I've done a lot of work, and perhaps someday we'll do some more. So museum architecture is a special area. I was for 20-some years the chair of the Smithsonian's Architectural History Department. My office was in there, and I wrote that book with a team of people that I got together and worked with on this. There are many museum buildings, but you would not think that I would have studied zoos, but I did, because the Smithsonian has a zoo, so I have a bit of a background in zoos and zoo architecture. Not a very long history. I did teach in the decorative arts program early in my teaching career, and so I became interested in the relationship between architecture and furniture and the spaces. I think you may recognize some of these by Breuer, by Mies, and by Wright. Right now, I am happy to be here at the university and have been here for 10 years teaching in the architectural history area. I was the architectural historian and preservation specialist for the Smithsonian. I'm a founding trustee of the National Building Museum, and I am very active still at the National Building Museum. It is a wonderful organization I'm proud to be associated with. I've had the blessing of being married 53 years and the support of a wonderful partner and the support of my children. These are the favorite things I do, and that's teaching. I'm always teaching. I love the critical intelligence. How do we evaluate active learning so that the students get to really be involved? I'm experimenting with that. And of course, the visual intelligence to be able to take a form and understand it and describe it. Now I have one more slide, and this is what you can do for us. Professor Gournay and I are doing a lecture called in a series called Democracy Then and Now. Can you stop this slide? Thanks. So our lecture is going to be on the architecture of Thomas Jefferson and how certain of his buildings seem to express his ideas about a new democracy. So we're trying to show intellectual ideas and visual forms. Now the important thing where we need your support on this is that this is part of a university-wide program called Democracy Now and Then. And all these scholars in their departments are giving these, and there's a lot of publicity, and fortunately they called us. And Brian said, oh yeah, we can participate. So we're doing this, but we need to be able to show them that our people are going to show up at this lecture. So it's October 24th. There's going to be plenty of food after it. Not only are they putting in money, but Brian's putting in money. Really, come and have dinner. And this is a little bit about the top, and it's going to have a lot of interesting, perhaps little known ideas, but most of all, please tell all those people who left and come and support your faculty. Thank you.
Where's the talk going to be?
In the lecture hall.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd. Next, we have Professor Jamie Tillman. Oh, lovely. You labeled yours nicely. It says Tillman. Some people just label it PechaKucha. It's hard to find.
You don't know who it is. So, we've really boiled down to a core group here. I'm so glad to see that. So the title of this is, Must We Mean What We Say? And let's just let that question hang over ourselves a little bit. A beginning, when we listen to our inner voice as a designer, there's personal points of reference in the world. What do you mean when you say something? What do you mean when you start drawing? So my thesis project began with a lot of drawing. And so on the right-hand side, there's some drawings that I did, kind of intuitive drawings. On the left, some of the artwork that I was interested in at the time as a reference, the Italian futurist, Umberto Boccioni. So on the right, these are actually some drawings from my thesis project. They were done with a blue Pentel pencil on Mylar, which is not a material that any of you have thought about, probably. But it's almost cheating when you draw with blue Pentel pencil on Mylar. It's just an amazing thing. So as a designer, sort of my trajectory was 10 or 15 years of practice, and then I actually assumed a leadership role in a firm in Westchester County. And because of the themes that I had kind of unleashed in some of my intuitive work, I was prepared for this particular project, which was a musculoskeletal institute at the University of Connecticut, which involved themes of movement and motion and spatial sequences and repetitions, a lot of things that I've been sort of examining in my drawings on an abstract level. And here, there's some conceptual sketches which resulted in a lobby space that was really, in effect, set in motion. It was about human movement through space, human motion, and this is the lobby space that had to do with placing people in an environment where they were going to be transported out of their daily routines. The building faces a wetland area and is essentially 60 feet by 120 feet of glass, which pulls back and reveals this wall, which is in fact appears to be moving. Some other themes in larger projects that I've done recently for the government. This is the National Guard Readiness Center in Arlington, Virginia. And again, these themes of serial composition and movement and motion and spatial sequence informed the way this building was organized. Half of it is actually underground, and it's defined by a transparent stairwell which links all of the levels from the low grade to above grade. And again, this is a vertical sequence of forms, whereas some of the other projects that I had done were based on other compositional themes. Also, we are in Washington, so the National Gallery, when it was built in 1978, was a particular inspiration for me. This is a triangular building. I was very interested in seeing what we could do with that formal language. Another project for which we branded the design concept. This is for the Social Security Administration. And the concept really had to do with creating an arced, transparent space, which we called the Arc of Light, which is kind of a double entendre. The Arc of Light, the Arc of Life, the Social Security Administration. When you present design, you have an opportunity to establish your themes and your context that you will be discussing with your clients. In this case, for NASA, I was very fortunate to be the lead designer for several buildings there. The first of which was the headquarters building. So context, craft, technology were all elements of the design conversation that we developed when we began to interact with this particular client. Public spaces. This is a place where many things come together in buildings, but in the case of NASA, this is where this sense of movement and motion, moving upward, moving outward, crossing thresholds, are all themes in that NASA universe. Second building we did there was really based on looking at some of the existing wind tunnel facilities and thinking about the metrics of speed as an architectural proposition. This is a campus conferencing center right in the center of the campus, and it takes as its major point of departure some of the language of the existing wind tunnel facilities that define that campus. And then bringing those concepts down to the level of tactility, the level of architectural detail. What can we go and touch? What do we experience most directly? And finally, some recent work in China, Research and Development Campus. There are a couple of you that will recognize this project. I won't point you out, but another opportunity in both an urban and a natural setting to begin to think about the language of research in a very different context. So it all comes back to drawing. We draw, we think, we create intuitive moments for ourselves that we analyze. This project is no different in terms of a design process. We're looking at the language of building from an intuitive perspective. Do travel. All of you thesis students and all of you architecture students and all of us. Very important to travel and to take your projects with you in your mind and expose them to different environments. So begin. What do you mean when you say, when you draw? How does it sound to hear yourself say this thing or that thing, or to articulate an idea here and in some other place? When you wake up in the morning, you begin to draw. I love the Stephen Hall quote. Things are clearer, and we begin with an intuitive moment of listening to ourselves and our inner voice. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, just to give everybody a sense of the closing lineup here, Professor Simon, then Professor Hurt, then I'm going to do a stand-in for Professor Lamprakos, and then Dean Cronrath. Okay, that's the order as we come to a closure here. Professor Simon.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be talking about design thinking as research and as a way of acting in the world. Is there anyone here who has a thesis in their future? I'm speaking to you. The 5 points of an abstract. So an abstract, when it's clear, sets the stage for design research. So you first need to ask, what is the research question? So I'm just going to show you an example with some images from work of one of my students. So how can transformable space-saving furniture promote sustainable living in compact spaces? Well, why is this an important question? Lots and lots of reasons. Millennials on a budget. There's a whole group of people out there who move, they want to have a light footprint, they don't want a whole bunch of bulky stuff taking up space. So, how will you investigate this question using design research methods? This is a very simple 5-step design thinking process that I learned at Stanford University. It begins with empathy, you define the problem, ideate, you prototype, and you test. So here is the way this particular student, Shadi Pratt, conceptualized the design thinking methodology in her project to design transformable space-saving furniture. So she's got the diagram then for her process, and this is the way she set out to do her design research. So the first thing she did was find out who's going to use this designed product. And she went out, she met a bunch of people, she observed them, immersed herself in their world, and she engaged with those users. Then, armed with that information, she defined the problem. She created an actionable problem statement. She articulated a specific, meaningful design challenge that she then took on and grappled with. Once the problem was sufficiently defined, then it was time to ideate, and she generated alternative ways to address that design challenge. At this stage of the process, you cast the net wide to think about all the different possibilities. So you don't begin to narrow down until you've really made your design space as wide as possible. Then you prototype, you make, and for us, really, the thinking and making often is one and the same process, but you want to make something people can interact with because you want to get some feedback. So when you have a prototype that you can hand to someone, show to someone, or even act out for someone, they can test it and you can receive feedback, both from hearing what they have to say about it, but also by watching the ways in which they interact with that prototype. And once you get some feedback, then it's time to iterate. You learn from the feedback and you do it over again, addressing those areas where you know that there's room for change, improvement, or just refinement. And then you test again. So you go through a loop where you are thinking, you're making, you're testing, you're getting feedback, you're learning, and you're doing it all over again. So a vigorous process where you are continually making stuff. So it's active. You're not sitting and thinking, but you're just out there making, doing, showing, and listening. So number 4 in that abstract, if you remember that's what it started with, what will be the result of your design research? What are you going to create? Well, in this case, it was a chair. And in your case, it could be many, many things, depending on what you define as your actionable challenge. So now, what's the impact of those results? So why did you do what you did? What impact are you going to make? What's significant about what you did? What can others learn from it? How can it improve the world? And how will you disseminate the results so they get out there to the world? Well, that particular student planned to patent her product design. We've lost the image, darn it. But there are many ways of taking your ideas out into the world. You can present your thesis or other design research to a client, to a firm, to a planning board. So take it out there to the people who are interested. You can take your work to a conference. You can co-author a paper or a poster about your thesis or other design research. I'm going next week with two of our graduates, Betsy Nolan and Rebecca Habtour, out to the Neuroscience Institute. We'll be out there presenting their work at this interesting architecture and neuroscience conference. You can co-author a paper about your work and publish it in a journal, as Maria Beltran, my PhD student, did with me. And incidentally, Maria and I have been traveling the world, going to conferences, and just having a great time getting feedback from a really diverse group about her research. You can publish your thesis as a book and sell it on Amazon.com, like one of our graduates, Mahmoud Riyad, did with his thesis about architecture and music. You can serve nonprofits and public institutions and serve the public good with your design research. And this is what I've been doing with my studios over the last few years. We've had some great clients, NASA, Girl Scouts of Central Maryland. We've worked with Al Narain University in Baghdad. Oh, I've lost this image. Is there anyone in this room who's currently in 600? Oh, okay, I'm really happy to see you because I'm teaching a 601 studio next semester. And again, it's serving a public institution. It's a new master plan for Glen Echo Park. And I'm taking a group of students there on, oh, what was the date? It was October 18th, a Tuesday at 1 p.m. And this studio is one of the regular topical studios, but something important about it, if there are any dual degree architecture and HISP students, it will serve your needs for a studio. And so I'd like to find out, is 1 p.m. on Tuesday, October 18th, a convenient time for anybody? Could you raise your hand if you think you might be interested in joining me? Okay, I've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. That's great. Fantastic. So could I ask you a favor? mgsimon@umd.edu. Send me an email with your name and just say Glen Echo yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Simon. Professor Simon, just forward me an email and I'll forward it to all the graduate students so that they get a chance to remember that. Professor Hurt. I'll get your slide in 1 second.
Take your time. There you go. I'm sure if I had gotten a different direction from Professor Kelly, this talk would be considerably different from what it actually is. It turned into a kind of a walk down memory lane for me, having to do with frustrations that I basically felt throughout my career, so to speak. And it struck me as I was sitting here thinking about this that there is a connection, I think, between what I'm going to talk to you about and perhaps where you are with the folks that are trying to figure out their thesis project, which is fundamentally this, which is that I was interested in studying architecture, but I didn't really know why. At least I didn't think I did. And as I think about it, looking back, a whole bunch of things are a whole lot clearer. For example, why in God's name did I, when it came time to do my thesis, did I convince 3 classmates to do their thesis project in the same town on the same street? I mean, what in God's name was I trying to do or prove or demonstrate? What frustration did I have, that led me to actually do that? Particularly why did I convince them that we would do it in Camden, New Jersey, which has got to be one of the most difficult towns to deal with that you could pick in the entire, I mean, in those days it was the sort of Youngstown of America, you know. Talk about setting yourself up for complete failure. That was it. So with that, that's not really the first slide, it's the second slide, right?
It's on the timer. It goes.
Well, I didn't tell you to start. Can we start over?
You get to slide 2.
Yeah. I like, no, the first slide, one more back.
5 seconds.
One more back, I'm fine, good. These are some of the things I like. Family, wilderness, and cities. And I keep trying to bring those pieces together as is demonstrated there. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I think that has something to do with what happened to me. I like this kind of architecture, all this kind of great modern architecture. That's at a domestic scale. I could have picked more modern examples, but as diverse as those are, they'll do just fine. I also like, well, can we go faster? I also like this kind of architecture, which is to say, I like monumental architecture. Again, possibly because I grew up in Washington, D.C., I like it for the fact that it personifies our national values, that it suggests that those values are timeless, and that it provides public space where we can challenge ourselves to live up to those values. When I started studying architecture, it seemed like a number of modern architects had brilliant solutions for how we might deal with problems that our cities might have, or their perceptions of problems that our cities might have. This was a disappointment to me. This was a disappointment to me because these proposals didn't really look very much like the cities that I loved, but I was a dutiful student, tried to study this stuff really, really hard. When it's done incredibly well, like it is done here at the Marseille block for the appropriate clientele, it works really well. When you do 33 of those buildings clumped together in a place like St. Louis, and it turns into a segregated public housing project, you complete the project in 1952, and between 1972 and 1976, you destroy it because it just didn't work. This is a cautionary note, if you will. It seemed that at that time, our cities were being torn up and destructed by a whole lot of forces. And this was extremely, distressing to me because on the one hand, I knew I was an architect. I was interested in architecture, but I was also interested in the city. And the question for me was, how could the architecture make the city better? And as far as I could see, it wasn't. Nor could I seem to find places where that problem was being worked on very successfully. So what did I do? I kept looking. One of the places that I looked was in academic environments. I did for a time work for the Philadelphia Planning Commission, which is represented here by Edmund Bacon, who wrote the Design of Cities book, and who no doubt was one of the most effective city planners in the US at the time. But it seemed to me that planning was generally too general. It didn't get down to enough detail, so I went back to architecture. I did manage to find the urban design program at Cornell, which is illustrated over here. It's Professor Rowe. It's the book that Rowe and Clear wrote, Collage City. But at that time, actually, this thing called urban design was in its infancy as a kind of spin-off of architecture because, in a certain sense, both the architects of the era had abandoned the field, as had the planners, so that the kind of projects that were represented by the Macmillan Commission Plan for Washington, D.C. were essentially non-existent at the time, you could look back at the same time that you had the Pruitt-Egos being built. You could look back and you could see that at an earlier time in our history, these architects had seemed to have done a phenomenally great job of making cities, but for some reason this was poo-pooed at the time. At the same time, you could go look at other places. You could go look at places like Paris or Siena, as different as they are, they're great, great cities. And then you could look at the American strip and wonder how it was that when we had models like this, we would go out and build this. It turns out that in both cases, there are a whole lot of rules and regulations that people have gotten together and made on the basis of a set of decisions, and that if you obey those rules and make good rules, you can make this, and if you obey those rules and make good rules, you can make that, and if you make really bad rules, you can obey them and make that. And that architects, as a general profession, we don't spend a whole lot of time being interested in or being concerned about those rules, when in fact it seems like we should. I started to teach school and teach architecture, and was considerably challenged by that effort. The challenge led me to a whole bunch of educational literature that I found interesting to compare it, and very instructive for, particularly for studio teaching. Also, some of the writings of Jean Piaget in terms of not just our behaviors, how we learn, why we fail, and so on and so forth, but also instructive with regard to languages of architecture. Taking that seriously, it turns out that there is a vast and increasing literature that we can turn to that talks about the kind of things that Professor Tillman just mentioned about tangible, how our bodies interact with architecture, how we physically interact with it. And in terms of perception psychology, which will come up here in a second on the next slide, the whole business about how it is that we see, why we see the way we do, why we react to space, form, and light, and how architects can use that effectively in the design of architecture. I was very dutiful in terms of studying all the great architects of early modern architecture particularly, and the influences from art on their work, and made great efforts to go see this stuff, and would look at a monument like the Schroeder House by Rietveld, and then discovered it was this teeny little building at the end of an otherwise very, very nice street, where all the other houses really looked a whole lot better than the Schroeder House by Mr. Rietveld, or as wonderful and much as I appreciate Le Corbusier, when I got to Chandigarh, which I can't show you, it's a really crappy city, and he was largely responsible for it. Or when I look at Mies van der Rohe, as much as I love the work by Mies van der Rohe, when I go to Chicago and see what he did with the Federal Center, not so great. And then along comes somebody like Robert Venturi, along with some other folks, challenging all the fundamental presumptions of all this stuff with his book Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, and his cute little house for his mother, which does not have a flat roof, actually has a facade, which is composed in a manneristic fashion, which has clearly a symbolic fireplace expressed by the, and then go on. Specifically, because of the influence of Colin Rowe, and the notion of dialectical conditions, that is, an argument between two different things, I think I began to understand a kind of both-and idea rather than an either-or idea. That one could indeed be involved with concerns of both stasis and change, individual and community, landscape and cityscape, internationalism and regionalism, the monumental and the domestic, the classic romantic and the modern, and that within that part of that sort of dialectical condition, there also began to emerge lots and lots of books that put emphasis on space, on place, genus loci, more than they had before. Other critics emerged. Matt Bell mentioned Andres Duane. We should also mention his wife, Liz Potter-Zeitek, DPZ, who did the project for Seaside. And the innovative thing about Seaside was that while they could have done all the buildings, instead what they did was they did the regulating plan and they made a set of rules that would govern the architecture and had any number of other architects come in and design the buildings, making it a much more cohesive and interesting environment, as they readily said, than if they designed all the buildings themselves. Inevitably, they would have looked too much alike. That and a project in New York City, which was Battery Park City, which also was doing the same thing, basically dealing with the idea of the extension of the existing patterns of the city. Those groups of people came together, created the Congress for the New Urbanism, which beginning in roughly 1990 has really gone about attacking all these different problems that have been endemic in the destruction of our cities and challenged any number of those notions at many levels. There are still two of us here on the faculty, myself and Matt Bell, who are founding members of the CNU. Ralph Bennett was a founding member as well. So, you know, what does it turn out? It turns out that the relationship between architecture and the city is really complicated. And it's a vast area that you can enter into and study in this effort of basically, if that's your interest, trying to get it right. It includes all of this stuff in general about our society, a whole bunch of stuff about the city, of which there's increasing literature, and at the same time, it doesn't leave out architecture, that there are a broad set of ideas that we can connect with, having to do with informing how it is that we make architectural space, all of which, and I could have done this with that first slide that Matt Bell showed, similar to this one, was, you know, the idea of the primitive hut at one end, the idea of the city at the other end. And as I was putting this together, it struck me that maybe our patron saint of architecture is not only pointing at the primitive hut, but she's pointing beyond the primitive hut to the city, and suggesting that we should pay attention to what that relationship is.
Thank you, Professor Hart. You know, since the crowd has dwindled, I'm not going to read Michelle Lemprakos' piece, because I'm going to ask her to come to the Architecture 797 class and do it. I just don't have the energy to do it. The crowd is small. The time it's getting late. So I'm going to ask Professor Dean Cronrath to come up and do his piece. I'm not being disrespectful to her. I don't think I have the energy to read somebody else's.
Small enough crowd, I don't need a microphone. You can all hear me, right? Yeah. So, thank you, Brian, for inviting me. It gives me a chance to check out my new hard drive that I had installed in my head. And while they were at it, they cut another hole in there, and I got a new memory stick as well. So this should really be good. I also know that I'm the last person between you and a drink. So I'm going to go really quickly. So here's the thing, most of us know that architecture is an object, right? That's what we all know. We're in objects all the time, we walk by objects. It's going too fast. But for me, fundamentally, architecture is a way of thinking. And to give you an idea of what I mean by that, my opening quote for my thesis at the University of California was this: at the end of history, all men, I inserted, and women will be poets. And that was a quote from Karl Marx, where he was aspiring or trying to tell us what he aspired the future of human beings would be when we finally got rid of an oppressive society. And so for me, that's how a thesis starts, is you need an idea, a proposition, a theme that you can lay out. With that, you then need to do a literature review. So you have to be able to place that theme, that proposition, that hypothesis within the landscape of ideas. And you've been in school for 6 years, some of you, 5.5 years, 5 years. And by now, you should know the terrain of ideas. You should begin to have a map that you can find where your ideas that you have proclivity to are located, so that in your thesis, you can mine that territory. To do that, you're going to need to construct an analytical tool that comes directly out of your thesis, or your theme, or your postulate. And then with that analytical tool, you're going to begin to analyze precedent. And by all means, that does not mean you copy the way in which Richard Meyer looked at precedent. Instead, you're going to craft your own tool based upon your ideas and begin to see how you can place your ideas and use them to critique and understand what happened in the past. You're going to need some site analysis and information. You're going to need an architectural program and analyze that. And the most important thing is, at the end, you're going to construct an argument that's going to support your theme or postulate. The result, we hope, is something that advances our discipline, because our discipline is not particularly forward. So here's the most important thing for me. What is a thesis? It's a proposition that's laid down or stated as a theme to be discussed or proved, that is to say, argued. And here are the things that, in my mind, a thesis can be about. A thesis can be about a designer. It can be about an investigation into a building type. It can be an interrogation of an architectural element, and it can be about delimiting a site. Any one of those things can be a proper kind of general area or chapter heading within which you develop a thesis. Okay, so what I was going to do is I was going to show you how that works for me. But I think it takes too long for that. So let me just say, tonight I heard a series of presentations. Some of our faculty colleagues are talking about phenomenology, and that is the territory that they want to look at. Others are behavioral determinists, and that's the territory that they're mining. Still others are technological determinists, and that is what they're looking at. Others are historicists, and that's what they're most interested in, and that's what they're mining. What you need to decide is, what are you interested in? What's that piece of territory, and where are you going? For me, this is the large territory that I'm interested in and what I'm trying to understand. But I have a very unique, distinct position relative to communication, because I am one of those who believes that meaning is indefinitely and forever indeterminate. That's very different than what most architects believe, and certainly very different from what the English department believes on this campus, right? So there are many places that you can locate yourself in this wide territory of ideas, the landscape ideas, and begin to explore. So for me, reality, nature, history, even what we see, what you see right now is a cultural construct. You have a lens in front of you that most of us don't even know exists. That's my point of view. That's my thesis. So for me, architecture shapes space, gives form to time. Those are the two most important things, and I try and understand how that works. So for me, architecture is a form of expression. What the hell does that mean? So here's a question that I ask you. What do you see when you think? Most of us, when we think, which is an inward-directed activity, if we're lucky to think visually, what we see is inside of us. It's not an outward thing. In fact, when you think very hard, most of us just stare into space. Right? For architects, that's a huge problem because we're about giving expression to things, and so we have to show people the idea of what you see when you think. This is Lou Conway. Someone else showed this today. They made an excellent quote about this building, which is you're overwhelmed by the horizon. It's an incredible Kantian idea about Kantian aesthetics. If you don't know about that, that's a piece of the landscape that you might want to go over and travel around in so you can figure it out. But for Kant, one of the ways that you achieve an aesthetic experience is by being overwhelmed by the size and magnitude of the cosmos. That creates a transcendental situation, and in his mind and in his philosophy, that led to ideas. Therefore, if you're a scientist and you're designing something for scientists and you're Lou Kahn, you draw upon Kant and you build this space in order to represent the idea of what you see when you think. Now, you don't have to take my word for any of this. These are some of the people, just like Matt Bell, that I'm influenced by. These are my superheroes. Your job is to build an army like this for you, so that when you talk about your thesis and you make your argument, it's not your personal idea against others, but in fact, it's an army of people who came before you, have given this great thought, and you're drawing upon them to craft your argument and develop your position. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Conrad. But one small correction, that you were the penultimate presenter, because I haven't had a chance to talk yet. And this was my salon after all. And so, even though I'm letting you off the hook and not going to present the material, this will be 6 minutes and 6 2/3 minutes. So the whipping boy today is Mies. And this talk is really just sort of more something that I've been thinking about in terms of architecture. Certainly every Monday morning when I get up to teach Architecture 201, I've been thinking about the quote that you can not invent a new architecture every Monday morning, and certainly Mies did not do that. It's certainly clear from the evidence in Mies's work that he took this seriously, because where else can an architecture school and a gas station and a museum and a chapel and a house all fundamentally embody the same vocabulary, the same reductivist thought, the same reduction to the absolute essential. Somewhere it was said, and I don't remember exactly where the quote originates, but part of the reason why Mies van der Rohe was such a great architect was that he almost invariably ignored program and applied the principles of universal space to just about every single problem that was put before him. He solved the same problem over and over and over. The question I have is, what does that do to the idea of meaning in architecture? When words lose their meaning, and words don't have a specific meaning anymore. When an architecture school or an apartment building or an office building or a federal building all have the same commonality to them. Now there's a flaw to that argument, obviously.
But this also makes me kind of question the idea of homogeneity and the notion of things like tools of the trade. So you can see doctor and architect and obviously lawyer over here, because I have to hit somebody on the head with that. Mechanic, obviously. And the tools of the trade used to distinguish the various disciplines from one another. And I'm not being critical of this. I love this. I'm waiting. I was thinking about waiting in line this morning for the new iPhone, but thought better of it. But if you think about it for a second, when you go to see your doctor, when you go to the lawyer, when you go to the architect, wherever you go today, work, everything, we're on a tack towards homogenization, where everything is the same. And it brings back to me the question about architecture. When architecture becomes the same, the response of architecture to just about every problem has the same answer, where does that leave us? Where might we go in response to that? And I think that in contrast to Mies, and again, I love, as Professor Hurd said before, I love Mies incredibly. I think it's important to study him. I think that in this diagram by Le Corbusier, these 4 types that he talks about is the seed of an idea. The idea of typology, of type, of formal type, of urban type, of functional type can be a form of resistance to the idea of homogeneity. Take, for example, this idea that by Le Corbusier, that the building is like a soap bubble. The exterior is the result of the interior. Presumably the program forces itself onto the exterior to shape the soap bubble, to shape the building. And it always makes me wonder, and I chose this bubble in particular with a little wart on it, because I'm really wondering whether when the bubble gets this sort of perfect perimeter to it and it's equally disposed, whether that's supposed to be the result or whether that's supposed to be the result of the case of the soap bubble. When there are exterior forces, though, however, when the exterior is also an interior, that tells me the architecture actually happens on that thin line there, the interface between the demands of the city and the demands of the program of the building. The Maison Citroën is a great example in Le Corbusier's work. It's a reoccurring project. It begins in 1920 as a project in his work, and it really has a very kind of simplified kind of diagram of a house. Large spaces to occupy, smaller spaces to support that occupation. And it occurs over and over in his oeuvre. That is, that you keep seeing this same type reappear and get refined, as in the Siedlung, Wiesenhof Siedlung, and as in the villa at Valkerson. The Wiesenhof Siedlung, you can see the kind of banding of the small band, the big band of occupiable space. You can see it turn 90 degrees. He didn't invent this. In fact, he appropriated a typology, the terrace house typology, which had been largely popularized in England, this big bay, little bay expression, and really tuned it up and made it a kind of essential type of his new proposition for the new city that we see on the far side. But it was also a type, a kind of intermediate type, that Le Corbusier deployed into context in the existing city. That is, it was a type that could exist both as an ideal and as a response to the circumstance. It was a type that was a contextual type. It was a type of modern architecture that could be deployed in the city. It was also kind of background type. So I really like the diagram by Leon Creer. We've seen it already today. Basically, it says cities are composed of 2 parts, the sort of monumental public realm and the private realm. And for a good city, according to Leon, and I think I agree with him, you need a lot more of that sort of background typology. And I've sort of updated this for your taste, so that to just sort of tell you that it doesn't matter what kind of monumental buildings, what flavor of monumental buildings you make, that if they were all leashed alone like that, you'd go nuts. And that the background typology, this consistent fabric of the life of the city, is absolutely essential. And it's also in Creer's books where he talks about the dangers of that kind of city, where it is only about the one-off typology of building, where there is not a kind of fabric of typologies that work together within the city. I feel one of the things that we seem to lack as a group of colleagues teaching architecture, and learning architecture together, is we seem to lack that understanding of typology. I look back to Stephen Hall's pamphlet architecture book, looking at the architectural alphabet, and really fundamentally talking about how cities we live in are made fundamentally of iterations of common typologies. Typologies are the bricks and mortar of making cities. The typologies exist within sites, within lots, within blocks, within the city, and even there's a rub against the typology of the architecture against the typology of the urban realm, the street, the interior of the exterior, the street. So I would just sort of say, I'd just sort of challenge everybody with the loss of typology in architecture is akin to the loss of language. Abstraction and abstract thinking are inherently part of our architectural lexicon, but let's be careful about how we allow abstraction to go. If abstraction works to eliminate typology, where are we? Where can we be? Okay, you guys were great this afternoon. Take care. Hopefully, I do really appreciate particularly the first year students that stuck around here this afternoon. Really, thank you for being here, okay?